The European adventure ends at the penultimate hurdle, and we will have to wait for another season before finally raising some silverware. And after this game, Unai Emery said, "This is all valuable experience and information we gleaned, which has inspired me to totally abandon the normal format of this show. I'm not going to review the game itself. We don't need to. This was always going to be a difficult task. What I am going to do, though, is look back at the three biggest lessons learned from this European adventure and also take a look back at the top three moments of our continental campaign. But first, a toast to the players, the staff, and especially the traveling supporters. Yes, I know we didn't get what we wanted, but that doesn't mean cherished memories weren't created in the process. Cheers. Welcome inside the parlor, and I would hope that you know me well enough by now to know that I like to look at life and football through the glass half full lens. So you won't be surprised to hear me say that I think this Conference League campaign could actually have a very meaningful impact on the future progression of this football club, which is hard to sort of fathom right now because we're all dealing with the disappointment of going from being favorites in this competition to exiting at the semifinal stage, especially for those fans who traveled and who might have already booked their tickets to Athens, where they probably already had a little look around.
Hi, my name's Darren, and you're watching the Holy Trinity Show.
Our entire game plan was predicated on the idea that we would not concede first. So when we did, on their first transitional moments, just 10 minutes in, it was the same thing as getting a shot to the button. You're stumbling around the ring. You are stunned. And outside of that, I thought we actually did exactly what Unai Emery wanted us to do, which was control the game. I checked the possession stats at the end of that first half. It was 83-17 in our favor, and our passing percentage was high in the 90s. The problem is, possession alone does not get you into the next round unless you come into the game with a lead. And they were simply more ruthless and clinical again, whereas we could not break down that low block. And this is an issue that has plagued us through several points in this season and needs to be addressed through recruitment and a very specific profile of player or players, because if you can't go around an opponent or over an opponent, or you can't win the transitional battle where you're just simply more powerful and ruthless in the final third, well, then you have to go through an opponent. You have to find a way. And fair play to the opponent, by the way, and their manager, because all the channels were consistently choked off. They were more fresh looking and they were more disciplined. And to be honest with you, Olympiacos just looked hungrier for this. Before we get into those lessons learned, you may have seen that the club put out a video featuring the president of business operations, Chris Heck, wandering around Villa Park with Gabby Agbonlahor talking all things Aston Villa. And I'll let you watch it and decide what you think about the sincerity and authenticity and the content in there. I thought it was actually quite good. But the biggest thing I gleaned from Chris Heck was how he characterized the relationship between footballing operations and the commercial business side of the club. Unai Emery and his technical team have over-delivered faster than I think anyone expected, because we are playing European football next year again. And so Chris Heck likened the two departments to two trains side by side on different tracks, and the football train is a bullet train. And so now the commercial locomotive has to catch up, and qualification to the Champions League would be like a turbo boost to this train. Conversely, a well-humming commercial locomotive can then help propel the football train and help it carry more passengers, ideally farther down the line. And this is where we're at right now. The commercial department needs to give resources to the footballing operations in order that it can go one station farther next year. And you know, I don't get the sense from either Unai Emery or Monchi, for that matter, that they really desire throwing around around huge sums of money unless they know they are getting premium, ultimate quality. I think they get just as much satisfaction out of doing really brilliant business and getting a lot of value out of a player signing, like Morgan Rogers, for example. I'm 100% convinced that the strategic nature of our technical team led by Monchi in the recruitment department is going to squeeze the very most out of every dollar spent in recruitment, and more so than the clubs that are in and around us. But Chris Heck did say that in order to be on the right side of profit and sustainability rules, the club still has to create new revenue streams. And maybe the biggest revelation of all was that would not occur away from Villa Park. And I think what has happened over Chris Heck's 1 year in charge and his evaluation and orientation process is he's come to realize that there is a heritage differentiator to Villa Park because there aren't many grounds left like it. And so it is its own attraction in some ways, and there's value in that. Samir was in Athens with the traveling faithful. What a beautiful backdrop it seemed to be. Do you know, I've never met anyone who has been to Greece and who's come back and said, I didn't enjoy myself. Didn't like the hospitality, didn't like the scenery, didn't like the food, didn't like the climate. I mean, I have heard it can get searing hot in the middle of summer, but that's what the ocean is for. Sadly, there won't be a return to this lovely place this year, and I hope the Villa fans who booked accommodation can somehow parlay that into a sublet maybe, but I think most are on the phones right now canceling and looking for refunds. Let's explore then the 3 biggest lessons learned from our first European adventure in ages, starting with number 3. Adversity can be more powerful than success over the long term. I want to compare Newcastle and West Ham United as 2 great examples of teams that had excellent campaigns last year one way or another, but then couldn't sustain that success this year. West Ham, first time of asking. In the Europa Conference League, go and win it. Their first European trophy since the 1965 European Cup Winners' Cup, and their first silverware since the 1980 FA Cup. But look at them this year. They're going to be a mid-table side, maybe as high as 9th, but probably 10th. And they've got a manager change looming for next year. Newcastle United had a fantastic season last year, qualifying for the Champions League, but then not being able to get out of the group or even dropping down in the Europa League. There is a chance the Magpies could qualify for Europe next season, but still, like West Ham, a good season was followed by a drop-off. And this is precisely what I believe our owners and the key leaders in both of the big departments want to avoid: the ups and the downs, which are the exact opposite of consistency, progression, and being demanding. So here we have an Aston Villa group that was favored to win the competition, and a core of players. I mean, just look at the spine. Emi Martinez, Konza, Pau, Louise, McGinn, Diaby, Bailey, Watkins. All of these players are going to be deeply disappointed. In fact, they may not even have time to be disappointed because it hasn't even sunk in yet. Let's hope there's not a further hangover, but this loss will stick with them for quite some time. The chance to get to the first European final for a club in over 40 years. I've heard this expression from multiple athletes across various sports. Players who say, I hate losing more than I love winning. Isn't that an interesting perspective? Take Manchester City, for example, having won the treble last year. Did it hurt as much going out of the Champions League to Real Madrid this year, having won it last year? Is there that hangover effect or a resting on your laurels feeling? I don't know. But the very best players in the world always remain hungry. And this is where the manager and recruitment are so important. Manager maintains high standards, but introducing the right people, fresh faces, new voices, better talent, keeps everybody on their toes. And where we are just so lucky is that we have a manager who is obsessive over details, analysis, strategy, professional development, not just for his players and his staff, but himself. And I am certain that he is going to take this disappointment and he's going to use it in a meaningful way to help us in the short term. Like the owners, the last thing that Unai Emery wants is to win something shiny in the short term if it then derails our overall progress. I think they all aspire to annual competitive excellence across multiple fronts. I've always been inspired by Barry Hearn, an East Londoner who's in his 70s now, but he's one of the most successful sports promoters on the planet. Virtually everything this guy touched turned to gold. And he has a series of life lessons, one of which is that disappointment and adversity are better teachers than success. And you know what? I agree with that. And there will be a lot of very disappointed players from Thursday night. And now they have this reference point, this hot button that they can remind themselves of when they're embroiled in very difficult and painful gym work or rehabilitation or training in a raging downpour or drinking a horrible kale smoothie in their own kitchen. Big lesson number 2. You simply cannot lose the entire tie in one leg, especially the home leg. It comes down to this, my friend. The reason why we are not going back to Athens for the end of May is because we lost the first leg 4-2 at Villa Park. And you can point to injuries, fixture congestion, the lack of fixture congestion for the opponent, and they would be valid excuses. But ultimately, we lost this tie at Villa Park because we didn't stick with our way, and we didn't maintain our emotions or our focus at critical points in the match, which were then ruthlessly punished. And just to piggyback off that third lesson, I'm telling you right now, the next time we play a European game at Villa Park, all of the players who were involved on Thursday, May 2nd, will get this little pang in their stomach to remind them of how close they were to a European final, but they could not manage the occasion. And it's a good reminder for everybody to not take your home games for granted, even if you're in a really good run of form there. For the most part this season, especially before the new year, we were exceptional at home. Did some sense of complacency set in the new year? Did we sort of think, well, we don't have to work as hard because we're at home, it's a fortress, we could overturn a deficit if we fall behind? I don't know if any of those things are true, but if we are to progress again this coming season in the league and in European competition, then we have to be consistently excellent at Villa Park, particularly defensively, because that's where it fell apart in 2024.
I'm Fletch.
I'm Colin Abbott, and we're watching the Holy Trinity Show.
Do you know that it's now been a year since the Holy Trinity Show and 24/7 services joined forces officially? And one of the first things I remember Paul Handsaker telling me was how badly he wanted to take his kids to an Aston Villa European final like the one he got to experience in 1982. And I know he would have included his dad, Ron, in that conversation because it was Ron who took Paul to Rotterdam in 1982. And ironically, Ron is 82. You'd never know by looking at him. But what's so interesting for me is, I'm watching Aston Villa over here and 24/7 over here, and there's very similar progression happening. It's steady, but it's consistent. And that's exciting. So, happy 1-year anniversary to Paul Handsaker and his entire team, and thank you so much for believing in the Holy Trinity Show. And the number one big lesson we learned from our European adventures: to be legitimate contenders in any competition, we must address the depth and quality of our squad this summer. Here I am, Captain Obvious, making that statement, and if a stiff like me makes that observation, you can bet your bottom dollar that the football department is aware of the issue. And I realize we had a lot of injuries, and every time you have an injury to a key player, guess what? You have to spread the load around amongst the others, then they get stressed, and more miles are put on them, and then they're bound to get hurt as well. But we really saw it on Thursday night with all the kids in the dugout, and I'm sorry to those who always say, well, just play the kids. The kids are not ready, and they're not going to be ready for quite some time. I'm sorry, that's the brutal reality. And you know what? We have Callum Chambers, Morgan Sanson, Phil Coutinho, Courtney Haas on our books. You can't tell me that if you clear those guys away and bring in even just one capable player who could step in those kind of situations, that isn't going to improve things. And those kind of moves have got to be made this summer. Finally, please. Every team is going to face injury problems at some point, but I simply refuse to believe that we are going to experience the same kind of injuries next year that we did this past year. I mean, we are well over 250 games lost through injury this year alone, and we're also third on the least rest between games table, which is just not a good combination. So if the club does not address this situation, that would be considered negligence, and I simply do not see them not addressing that issue. And it has to start with the fringe, by the way. You have to clear out the fringe, finally. I'm using British Columbian lumberjack forestry terms here. You got to burn the slash, because it's the slash that's preventing the big trees from growing bigger. Clear out the slash, and you'll have bigger trees. In the old days, we used to just try to drag in any warm body that happened to be available, and that's how we ended up with Danny Drinkwater and Birkir Bjarnason. But that is no longer our way. If you are not improving your squad with every player you recruit, you're doing it wrong. And in order to do that, you need tact and strategy. You need to have exceptional scouting. You need to be a really dogged negotiator to squeeze every dollar you can in value out of that deal. And you know what? You need to romance people as well. Agents, players, their families, opposing sporting directors. Thankfully, we finally have the people in place to do exactly that. And if we qualify for the Champions League, well, now we have the biggest carrot to lure players over, maybe away from other clubs that want their services but don't have Champions League football. And again, using a stock analogy, if you have a stock in your portfolio that's up here and you think it's reached its maximum value, well, then of course you sell it. And with the funds you create, you buy more stocks down here and hopefully grow them higher. I'm positive that Monchi and Unai Emery will have identified at least a couple of players that they think have reached the very maximum of what they can offer Aston Villa Football Club, and that they're going to sell those players and then reinvest those funds to grow future assets. And here's an example of how perhaps Monchi and Unai Emery may reflect on this year and actually change some of their ideology in terms of how they go and recruit, because both of them covet regular international players because they play in big games and they have a lot of experience. But if you're recruiting, say, two central midfielders, for instance, and one is a regular South American international, considering how taxing this year was, how demanding with all the games, might you lean towards the player that puts on fewer air miles during international windows? So as difficult as Thursday night was, especially when El Kaabi scored just 10 minutes into the match on their first transitional moment, thus tripling the degree of difficulty of the task at hand, it's still valuable data for the players and staff. And our staff happens to be insatiably curious about data, analysis, progression, and growth. I mean, Unai Emery said it afterwards. This European adventure was all about getting information and experience. There you have the top 3 lessons. Now let's shift to my top 3 moments from our European campaign, starting with number 3, and it was a game. It was the away trip to AZ Alkmaar. Isn't it weird how the Eredivisie, according to UEFA, is the 6th best league in Europe, whereas the Greek league is all the way down at 17th? And we can go away to what was the second place team in the Eredivisie at the time, AZ Alkmaar, and beat them soundly in their arena, and yet we had so much trouble beating the 4th place team in the Greek league. And that's football. It's all about what happens on the day. One set of players has a certain mentality, their bodies feel a certain way, and on the other side, it could be completely different. And I'm sorry, nothing was going to stop Olympiacos from achieving its first ever European final, which happens to be just 20 minutes up the road from its stadium. But back on October 26th, Villa put on one of the displays of the season, humbling the hosts from Amsterdam and allowing the players to believe, in the fans as well, that we were good enough to win that group. The number 2 moment, and one I will not soon forget, and one that proved pivotal in our ability to win the group, but John McGinn's late winner at home against Zrinjski Mostar. Now, keep in mind, we had just come off the loss at Legia. We had 0 points on the board in our group, and it's 0-0 in the 92nd minute. And what that game proved to me, it doesn't matter what country you come from or what league you're in or how high UEFA ranks your league, when you arrive at a ground, you have 1 point. And you've got 90 minutes to either hold on to it, build on it, and obviously, hopefully, not lose it. And on that day, the doggedness, the determination, stubbornness, organization of Zrinjski had a lot of us fans thinking, maybe we don't have what it takes to compete in this competition right now and maybe get out of this group. And who would pop up in the 93rd minute to glance home the winning header? None other than our captain, Super John McGinn, right in front of the Holt end. And as I said on that particular show, it's those dramatic, climactic moments that are sometimes more memorable and more indelible than even a 4-0 win at home over Ajax, for example. And the number 1 moment from our Europa Conference League campaign, obviously and undoubtedly, Dibu's denial. Our game in Lille would prove to be our shining moment in this competition, even if we were not the best side over those 2 legs. I will say that for the millionth time, and I will go to my grave believing that. And it was at around this time and after this game that the word destiny started to appear when talking about Aston Villa. And teams that go on to win silverware will have a run at some point on that journey where they are not the best team, yet still manage to win. That game for me was stressful, taxing, emotionally draining, that required a late miraculous Matty Cash goal just to get us to extra time. But when it went to penalties, it was as if it was written in the stars, because you knew the best goalkeeper in the world, the penalty whisperer, Emiliano Martinez, would be our edge. And sure enough, he provided us with a beautiful moment that none of us will forget. A moment that might not have even happened had we not beat Brighton and Hove Albion 2-1 on the final day of the season just 10 months before. I will look back on this entire campaign with so many sensational moments that cannot be overshadowed by what happened on Thursday night. I mean, this has been the greatest season cumulatively of all things that happened in my entire adult life. And believe me, I will blubber like a child when, hopefully, John McGinn hoists a trophy over his head. But I can't help but feel that the disappointment of Thursday night is kind of a meaningful step in that direction, and you can't really appreciate the achievement sometimes until you go through that disappointment. And I'm saying when that achievement occurs, not if, with our manager. Do I even bother previewing the Reds game? Because I'm starting to sound like a broken record here. It is going to take a monumental effort to get something out of the final home game of the season, Jurgen Klopp's last road game of the season, given the state we're in right now as a squad. Then again, having it on Monday gives us an extra day of rest. And I could see Aston Villa actually cobbling together some kind of a result just because it is Liverpool and they haven't had the greatest run in themselves. And by the way, I still don't think it's going to matter simply because of the form that Spurs are in right now. And they're going to have to host Manchester City the following Tuesday. Man City's fighting for the title. The summer sunshine has already descended on British Columbia, Canada. We are in the throes of Stanley Cup hockey fever in this city. And on Wednesday night, my beloved Canucks came from 4-1 down to beat the heavily favored Oilers 5-4 in Game 1 of a best-of-7 series. And the thought did cross my mind, am I asking for too much from the sports gods to expect 2 back-to-back comeback victories for my teams? Alas, that would be the case. Until Liverpool, be well, and of course, and as always, up the mighty Villa.